And welcome back to another podcast with Mr. Hagan. And on this podcast, we're going to continue talking about the how to calculate price indexes, what a price index means, and then we're going to use that to go back and connect to nominal and real gross domestic product concepts that we've talked about on previous podcasts. So on one previous podcast, we talked about how to calculate the cost of a market basket, and then we took the cost of that market basket and compared it to the base year, and then we were able from that to calculate the price index, and then we said, what is the meaning of a price index? And the meaning of a price index is you take the price index, subtract away 100, and that will tell you the percent change in prices since the base year. So, for example, if we just look quickly here at year 4, in year 4, the cost of the market basket was 18. We compared that back to the cost of the market basket in the base year, which was 10, multiplied that by 100, gave us a price index of 180. I'm doing all this very quickly because it was done on previous podcasts. That gives me a price index of 180. What does that mean? Subtract away 100, and that tells me the prices in year 4 were 80% higher than they were back here in the base year. Okay, prices were 80% higher than they were back in the base year. And then this price index can be used in all kinds of ways. One way that it can be used is to calculate wages, to compare wages from one time period to wages in another time period. So to calculate real wages, you take the wage rate, divide it by the price index, and that will give the real wage during that year compared back to the base year. And same thing when you think about, income, same thing, is you take the wage rate divided by the price index, and that takes you back to what the real income was during the base year. So however you want to think about it, in real income or real wages. So economists, we do this kind of stuff all the time where we want to compare two time periods that have different price levels. We just divide out the price level, and that way we are comparing real things to each other over time. The best way to think about this, or not the best, but one of the most important, is to think about calculating the real gross domestic product. So the real gross domestic product, this is the same concept as I just mentioned. The real gross domestic product is calculated by taking the nominal gross domestic product and divide it by the price index over 100. So what we are doing is we're taking the nominal GDP includes in it both changes in production and changes in prices. And then what we're going to do is we're going to divide out the price changes so that we just have the real stuff, the real production. That's what we want to focus on. So let's using the data from years 6 and 7 that we calculated back here on the previous podcast, we found the price index in year 6 to be 105. So prices were 5% higher than they were the base year. And then year 7, the price index was 80, which means prices were actually 20% below where they were back in the base year. And then we can use that data from these price indexes to calculate the real gross domestic product. So let's say that in year 6 that economists have gathered all the data, and we found that the nominal gross domestic product in year 6 was $225 billion. We produced $225 billion worth of final goods and services produced inside the country in that year. But we want to know what was the real gross domestic product, because in year 7, we collected the data, and we also found that we produced $225 billion of final goods and services inside the country. So I want to know which year did we do better? And if you just look at the nominal GDP, it looks like we produced the same amount of stuff. We produced $225 billion worth of goods and services. However, the prices in year 6 were different than the prices prices in year 7. So to get a real comparison between years 6 and 7, we need to divide by the price index over 100. So here we go, real gross domestic product. So to calculate the real gross domestic product in year 6, the real GDP is equal to the nominal GDP, which we're pretending was calculated to be $225 billion. So I'll just say $225 billion worth of goods and services, divided by the price index, which in year 6 we said was 105. So the price index was 105 divided by 100. Now, I'm just going to do that real fast. That 105 divided by 100 is 1.05. So that's what goes here in the denominator. That's what goes here in the denominator is 1.05. Remember, that's 105 divided by 100. That's how I got this 1.05 number. So then I take the 225 billion divided by 1.05, and I get in year 6 the real gross domestic product, if you do this division, is $214.28 billion. Okay, so the real gross domestic product was a little bit lower than what the nominal made it look like. Now, let's compare that to year 7, because we still don't know. Was year 6 better than year 7? Well, I don't know yet. I have to calculate the real gross domestic product for year 7. So again, we're going to take the nominal gross domestic product, which is $225 billion. We're going to take $225 billion divided by the price index for that year, which was 80. So prices were lower that year. So we're going to take that price index of 80. And then remember, we're going to do the same thing, price index divided by 100. So that's 80 divided by 100 equals 0.80. So I'm going to do 225 billion divided by the price index over 100, which is 0.8. And that's going to give me a real gross domestic product of $281.25 billion. Now we can say what year did we have the higher real gross domestic product, and that would be year 7. So if we look at the nominals can be misleading. The nominals made it look like we produced the same amount in year 6 as we did year 7, and that's because changes in prices are distorting things. So to get the real, to find out what really happened, we have to divide out the prices. Here it is. We got to divide out the prices, and that gets us to the real gross domestic product measured in base year prices, which, by the way, that base year was right here, year 1. Okay, so both of these, year 6 and year 7, are being connected back to year 1 so that we can compare them to each other, and we find that gross domestic product, real gross domestic product, was higher in year 7 than it was in year 6. It was higher in year 7 than it was in year 6. Let's take a quick look at some real data here. So here I'm looking at some GDP data, and let me just I think I'm a little off here. Let me just move this over so you can see it. There we go. So if we look at the gross domestic product, the nominal gross domestic product right here in 1986, it was 4.5 trillion, but the real gross domestic product was 7.8 trillion. The difference between those two, between the nominal and the real, is the price index. Okay, so you would take we use something called the GDP deflator. They're making 2009 right here be the base year, and then you're using the GDP deflator. It's just a price index, and they use this price index called the GDP deflator to take the nominal gross domestic product divided by that price index over 100, and that gets you to this real gross domestic product. Now, there's a lot of price indexes out there. One of the most well-known ones is the consumer price index. So let's just look at that very quickly and say, what does this consumer price index mean? First of all, it has a base year or base years of 1982 to 1984 equals 100. Remember, the base year is always 100 for a price index. And so in 1986, the price index was 109.6. What does that mean? That price index of 109.6 means that prices, subtract 100 from it, prices were 9.6% higher in 1986 than they were in this base period. That's what that means. Or if we go to 1996, the consumer price index was 156.9. Subtract 100. That means prices were 56.9% higher than they were in the base year. Let me jump ahead here real fast. So I'm going to jump ahead. So I jumped ahead to 2012, right over here, and the price index, which is down here. This is that consumer price index. And by the way, when I say consumer price index, the consumer part means that that's the market basket. We are looking at the market basket that the typical consumer would buy. So it's called the consumer price index. It's measured off of a market basket of typical consumer goods. So in 2012, which is the most recent data I have on this chart, the consumer price index was 229.6. Subtract away 100, that means prices are 129.6% higher than they were back in the base period of 1982 to 1984. Let's take a look at one last statistic here. So let's go back to earlier. Let me slide this over again. I'm going back here to 1929. In 1929, look at the CPI was 17.1. In 1933, the CPI was 13.0. Let's just think about what that means, that 13.0. What do? You subtract 100 from that. You subtract 100. So that means prices were 87% below the base year period of 1982 to 1984. Okay, their prices were 87% below where they were in the 1982 to 1984 period. That's how we think about the CPI and how we read it. So there's been another podcast with Mr. Hagan looking at price indexes. We will talk more about prices on future podcasts, and we'll see you on those future podcasts.